The Memphis school's security procedures prevent a mass shooting. Plus, National Review's Charles Cooke on the court's dismantling President Biden's gun agenda. That and more on this episode of the Weekly Reload Podcast.
No, the devil's got no hold on me.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of the Weekly Reload Podcast. I'm your host, Stephen Gutowski. I'm also the founder of thereload.com, where you can head over and sign up for our free newsletter today if you want to keep up to date with what's going on with guns in America. This week, we are going to be discussing President Biden's gun agenda and sort of the last domino to fall in it, with a recent ruling out of the Fifth Circuit, where a panel decided that the pistol brace ban the president asked for from the ATF is likely unlawful. And to do that, we have somebody who can speak to both the legal aspect of this and the political aspect of it. National Review's Charles Cooke. Welcome to the show, Charles. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
I really appreciate you doing this. I think when I want to talk about the political and legal side of firearms, you're the person I think of first. So I'm glad you're able to join us this week. You saw this ruling come down where the Fifth Circuit panel said essentially the ATF violated the Administrative Procedure Act and that its rule sort of reclassifying all guns that have pistol braces on them as unregistered short barrel rifles, something that has very serious consequences, right? A federal felony, up to 10 years in prison, huge fines if you don't register these things, that's not lawful. What's your make of that decision?
Well, I think it's of a piece with the general approach to firearms law and the law in general that the Biden administration has been taking for a long time, especially since 2022, when the Democrats lost control of the House. It's telling that these cases are not, in the main, being struck down on Second Amendment grounds, although Justice Willett in the Fifth Circuit did write separately to say he suspects there could be a successful Second Amendment challenge to this pistol brace rule. They're being struck down on separation of powers grounds. Now, of course, your listeners will know this, but it's worth recalling, nevertheless, that the Constitution in Article 1 places all legislative power, that's the language, all legislative power in Congress, not in the president. The president, outside of the realm of foreign policy, has no free-floating domestic political power. Anything that he does has to come with the permission of Congress. Congress has not given President Biden permission to change any of the gun laws in the last year, not in the realms that he wants to change the gun laws. And so those laws stay where they are. So instead of getting congressional acquiescence, he has tried to use the executive branch and reinterpret the laws, I would say twist the laws, to get the results that he would like to achieve via Congress, but can't. So what we have seen here is a series of decisions made by the executive branch that clearly have no basis in the underlying statutes and that has been struck down by the courts because the courts are full of judges who can read the law and its plain meaning and its terms of art. So, this one is a good example of it, this pistol brace issue. It could be, I think it probably wouldn't be, but it could be constitutional for Congress to ban pistol braces, or at least to redefine where they sit in the regulatory scheme. But it didn't. The notion that pistol braces alter in a material way the nature of a firearm such that it becomes an item regulated under the National Firearms Act or becomes prohibited entirely is ridiculous. So that's the context. You've got a president who cannot get what he wants through Congress and is, as a result, trying to redefine it. Now, before we move on, the Administrative Procedure Act part is important because it is not the case that the executive branch is able to, on the fly, redefine federal law. It was the case during the New Deal for a while, and it caused regulatory chaos. I have personal objections to much of the way the New Deal empowered the executive branch. But those aside, to rein in the president, the Congress in, I think, 1946, 1948, passed this law, the Administrative Procedure Act. And what it basically says is that if the executive branch wishes to redefine what terms mean or make substantive changes to the law based on its reading of a congressional statute, it has to do so over a longer period of time with a public comment period, giving warning to all involved and justifying itself. The presidents since that time have never particularly liked this because it's there to stand in the way, put sand in the gears. You may remember during the Trump administration, Donald Trump was reprimanded a few times by the courts for not following the Administrative Procedure Act. It turns out that Joe Biden doesn't like it any more than Trump did. That's one reason among many. His student loan plan was struck down.
Yes.
And he's now running into issues with this with his gun policy as well. So ultimately, what we're looking at here is a series of defeats that are the product not of Second Amendment determinations, but of separation of powers.
Yeah, certainly, and I want to focus on that a little bit more. But first, I want to talk just a touch on why the court felt that the Administrative Procedure Act was violated by the ATF in this case, because the ATF did go through the rulemaking process, right? They put out a proposal for this rule. They had a public comment period. They had a lot of very negative comments. I think it may have set the record for the most negative comments that a rule proposal has ever received in the Federal Register. But regardless, they, at least on the surface, and I'm sure the DOJ has argued this, that they did follow the Administrative Procedure Act. But the panel found that actually, in practice, they didn't. And one of the big problems they had, and you kind of see this across all of these recent gun rules that the Biden administration has either defended or put in place themselves. But the ATF has been pretty inconsistent and contradictory even at times in how they've looked at all of these issues. And in this case, the panel said that the proposed rule that they put out for public comment that they notified people about was so different from the actual final rule that effectively undid all of this work that they had put in.
Yeah, so administrative law can get quite complicated, but one of the rules that has developed both as a result of the text of the Administrative Procedure Act and also the way in which courts have interpreted and enforced it is that it is not sufficient to follow the terms of the Administrative Procedure Act in a pro forma way. What you can't do is say, here is a rule that we wish to make. We will be taking your comments. Thank you for your comments. We're ignoring them. Right? You can't just collect 500,000 comments, throw them in a trash can and say, we're doing it anyway. You have to absorb them, show that you have acknowledged them and respond. The other thing you can't do, as you say, is say we're going to pass Rule A. Then when Rule A invites all sorts of specific comment, say, and here's Rule B. There has to be some material connection between Rule A and B. And from what I can see, the Biden administration, it was guilty of both of those infractions in that the final rule did not resemble the one that it had put into the system, and it tried to shortcut the response and comment part of the process. Now, it's worth saying, as more context, that in one sense this is inevitable because the underlying statutes that the Biden administration is trying to use here in the various cases that it's litigated quite clearly do not do or say or allow what it's trying to achieve. And that's because although one could like it or dislike it, federal firearms law is pretty well written. It's quite closely parsed textually. And whatever blood could be wrung out of the stone by those who wish to amend it without Congress has already been wrung out. You know, we're talking here very often about laws that, while they may have been amended around the edges, are very old. The 1934 National Firearms Act, the 1968 Gun Control Act, the Brady Act of 1993. You know, the youngest of the ones I just mentioned, that's 30 years old. Lawyers have had a lot of time to pore through these statutes and try to change them, and try to alter their definitions, try to get gun control or obviate gun control without the permission of Congress. You know, 30 years, what is that? That's 55 years. And then you've got nearly 90 years to do this. So when the Biden administration is advancing these ideas, whether it's defending the bump stock ban that Donald Trump initiated, whether it's this pistol brace ban, whether it's the ghost gun regulations, they're doing so with text that has been largely static and is quite closely written. And that means that it is far more likely that a court is going to look at its behavior and determine that it hasn't either met the statutory threshold or complied with the administrative law. Because you're not talking about an area where the lawyers on both sides and the courts and their clerks and the amicus briefs, you know, are dealing with an idea that had never been thought of before. Take the student loan case. Now, I was outspoken on that. We won't go into the detail, but the HEROES Act of 2003 probably was never mentioned again by anyone in American politics between 1 minute after it passed in 2003 and the day the Biden administration said he was going to do student loan relief with it. You know, suddenly everyone had to become a HEROES Act expert. That's just not true of the US Code in relation to firearms. We all know what it says. We all know its provisions. And Biden is running up against a brick wall because of that.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting too, because you know, as you say there, the text of these laws that they're trying to reinterpret are pretty static. They haven't really changed much in decades. But the ATF's attempts to interpret them and apply them have definitely been all over the place, right? I mean, the big critique that you see in this ruling for the pistol brace rule or ban is that they put in their proposed rule a point system where you could, you know, they still have plenty of criticisms over it, that there were still a lot of sort of subjective measures involved in this point system, but that, you know, there was some way you could look at the gun you have and try to determine whether or not it even fit under this proposed rule about what, you know, is classified as a SBR and what's just a regular firearm. And then they just removed that altogether from the final rule. And of course, before the rule was even proposed, the ATF had been sort of all over the place on the legality of pistol braces or the legal standing of them. First saying, these are not stocks. They're not designed and intended to be shouldered, which is the key provision, separating a short barrel rifle from that's regulated by the National Firearms Act from a firearm that's not regulated by the National Firearms Act. And then they sort of changed that interpretation. They said touching it to your shoulder is a redesign. Then they said it wasn't. And then they put through this rule, and then the rule changed. And you see this over and over again with all three of these examples, right? And I think that's why perhaps the more fertile ground and challenges for these has been over administrative powers, and as well as you know, sort of the rule of lenity, which talks about you know, giving the benefit of the doubt to the person charged with a crime over the government if it's unclear what a statute actually says or how an agency has interpreted it. Is that what you find looking at this, that's perhaps why these challenges have been about procedures or agency power instead of Second Amendment cases under Bruin?
Well, yes, in that, as I say, you've seen a long train of attempts, and therefore it's unlikely the latest one is going to succeed, and therefore it's more likely that the executive branch is going to skip stages. I mean, a good example of this, I know you want to talk about this separately, is this phrase engaged in the business in federal law that determines who is and who is not obliged to become a federal firearms license holder.
Which might be the next, that seems like that might be the next thing that the Biden administration tries to make a rule about.
Right. Now, the interesting thing about that language, I think it was two interesting things that underscore just how difficult this is for the executive branch and should be under our system of government. The first one is that President Biden, if he does indeed propose a rule here, which he suggested that he was going to a few months ago, would not be the first president to do this. You know, the Obama administration tried the same thing. This was the big announcement they made when they became frustrated that they couldn't convince Congress to change the law. The Obama administration issued press releases. President Obama himself made speeches. They looked into whether or not they could materially alter the definition of who is and who is not obliged to become an FFL. So did the Clinton administration. I mean, this is a well to which Democratic administrations have returned over and over again.
Ironically, they're kind of going in the opposite directions because Clinton wanted to force people to stop being so-called kitchen table dealers, and Obama wanted to force people to become FFLs.
That's right.
That's
so right. But they're all trying to manipulate to their own ends the same piece of language. And then the second reason it's interesting is that this language was actually changed, albeit in a very minor sense, with the bipartisan gun control bill that was passed, was it last year? The year before? Last year.
June 2020.
Yeah, June 2022. But not in a way that allows the Biden administration to do what it currently wants to do. So on that one, the Biden administration wants what he calls universal background checks. Your listeners will know what that means. There is nothing in federal law that permits the federal government to impose universal background checks. Some states have them, other states do not. The Brady Act did not extend to non-commercial intrastate transfers of firearms. The same rules as apply to FFLs. My reading of that history is that was a deliberate attempt to keep the bill within the federal government's explicitly enumerated powers. Others have said it was a quirk of drafting or an oversight, but whatever it was, the law is really clear on this. And this has upset two American presidents in a row. Bill Clinton, towards the end of his presidency, did want to move towards so-called universal background checks after Columbine because there was this obsession with gun shows. But it was really too late by the time that he took that up. But Barack Obama was obsessed with this. This was the holy grail of gun control for Barack Obama. Was not a ban on so-called assault weapons, although he did later come to favor that, but was so-called universal background checks. And he couldn't find a way of changing the law. Joe Biden got Congress to change some of the ancillary terms within that provision in federal law, and still there is obviously no way of him doing it. So what did he promise to do? Well, I don't know what he's going to do in practice, but what he promised to do a few months ago was to get as close as he could to universal background checks by redefining this measure. Now you ask, well, why is this? Why has the fight in the courts been mostly over statutory language and the Administrative Procedure Act and not the Second Amendment? Well, the answer is that we've never got to the Second Amendment portion of these fights. We've never got to the merits. If Congress passed a bill that imposed universal background checks, then the case would be on the constitutional merits only. That would be the only question that was put before the courts. Is the federal government allowed to bind the states in this way, in circumstances in which there is no interstate commerce? And is it a violation of the Second Amendment? That's what would go to the court. But with this case, the first question you have to ask was, well, was the president allowed to do this in the first place? And the answer to that just always seems to be no. So, that's why we haven't got to these Second Amendment challenges, because the means by which these ideas are being tried is a violation of Article 1.
Yeah, I mean, it does read, if you go, especially if you go through the latest ruling, like these are just sort of the easier claims to win at this point, because I think this panel basically said we can decide this on APA. We don't even need to go to the Second Amendment claims. They were mentioned, they were brought in that case, and they were mentioned by the concurrence from Willett, as you noted earlier. But the panel just said we don't even need to go there, because the easier path is just to point out that this doesn't work under the agency's authority granted by the APA. So. That does seem like the bottom line, right? That these orders are weak enough, at least according to Fifth Circuit judges. All these rulings have come out of the Fifth Circuit in particular. But
you mentioned
although
the Fifth
Sixth Circuit did,
and you will get people who will say, well, it's forum shopping, and the Fifth Circuit is particularly likely to strike down this sort of rule. There is some truth to that, but I do think it's worth pointing out that during the Trump administration, Chief Justice John Roberts became a stickler for compliance with the Administrative Procedure Act. And under both the Trump and the Biden administrations, the Supreme Court has been really intolerant of executive action that cannot be substantiated by the statutes that are being used. So while it may be the case that the Fifth Circuit is more likely than, say, the Ninth Circuit to agree with the plaintiffs, we're talking about the Supreme Court in all of these cases ultimately, and the Fifth Circuit is actually closer to where the Supreme Court is than many of the other circuits, which is sort of a good early warning mechanism. Yeah,
I would agree with that analysis too. And I should mention that the Sixth Circuit also struck down the bump stock ban under this same basic concerns as the Fifth Circuit anyway. And it is interesting too to see what you noted there, that we obviously on this show we talk a lot about the Supreme Court and how it views the Second Amendment, and that's been an especially hot topic since Bruen was handed down last year for obvious reasons. But the other noticeable trend from the court is that they are very skeptical of agency overreach, and so these cases, and as we're filming this, we're still waiting for the Supreme Court to hand down its decision on whether or not it's going to intervene on an emergency basis in the ghost gun case. We don't have that news yet. We hopefully will by the time we get to our news update when we film that later today. But because we're filming on Friday here, but it seems like these cases all have a really good chance of standing up. The reasonings used by these judges in the Fifth Circuit, if they do end up at the Supreme Court. Do you think that's accurate?
I think that's accurate, especially since last year, because there's been two developments in our jurisprudence over the last 3 years, both of them salutary for advocates of the right to keep and bear arms. One of them, as you say, is that the Supreme Court has become less and less tolerant of executive overreach. And you've seen this with the growth of the major questions doctrine and of a stickler approach to the Administrative Procedure Act. And then on the Second Amendment, we've seen Bruen. Bruen has changed the game in ways that are not yet completely obvious, but it raised the bar that Heller had left quite low. One of the problems with Heller was that there was no standard of review. The instructions contained no real analytical framework for lower courts to use. And as a result, many lower courts simply continued as if Heller had never happened after McDonald had incorporated it to the states. Bruen, with a conscious and explicit admonition from Clarence Thomas, ended that practice. And it instituted a comprehensible standard, which is the existence of a historical analog. It made it clear the Second Amendment's not a second-class right. And it instructed the lower courts to adhere to its guidelines instead of ignoring them. So you've now got lower courts that are aware that the Supreme Court is unlikely to tolerate executive branch shenanigans, and that the Supreme Court is serious about enforcing the Second Amendment. And I think those two things in concert have made it a much better environment for those of us who think that the Second Amendment deserves to be upheld in the same way as would any other part of the Constitution.
And so that's sort of the legal side of all this, right? What about the political side? You know, obviously we are in an extremely unique and novel political environment right now, with former President Trump being charged by current President Biden's DOJ for a litany of things we don't need to necessarily litigate here beyond saying that it's obviously not a normal cycle. Former President Trump is still leading in the primary polls across the Republican primary spectrum here. So, I don't know. It is difficult to obviously apply your sort of traditional political analysis to all this stuff. But I would imagine, though, that having your entire gun agenda that you've implemented since becoming president tossed by the courts is not going to be very helpful for you in a reelection. I mean, am I far off there? Where do you see this all playing out politically?
I think that's essentially right. And I'll tell you why. I think it's right because Biden has essentially poked a section of the electorate that really cares about the Second Amendment without getting anything for it. So the counter argument would be that he would be able to run against the courts, he would be able to run against Bruin, he would be able to run against Trump and the Republican Senate of 2018 to 2020 that appointed so many conservative judges, and say, look, all of this gun control that you want is being stopped by extremists. But I don't think that's right. A couple of reasons. First off, the changes that he has tried to make are incomprehensible to most people. We're not talking here about some obvious or self-evident policy where the public divides. Whether or not to reclassify pistol braces, whether or not ghost guns count as if this is indeed the next one, what engaged in the business means. I mean, yes, there are ways to spin those, but you end up in most cases sounding like a fool when you do it. If you really try to tell people that pistol braces make firearms more dangerous, you lose as many, if not more people than you gain. So there's
because most people don't know what a pistol brace is.
Well, they don't know what one is, but they also know after about 7 seconds explanation that it obviously doesn't make the gun more dangerous.
Sure. And also the people who do know what a pistol brace is.
And that's what I was going to say and that's the problem, is that you therefore you don't bring too many people over on your side or get them particularly wound up against these fictional enemies that are rewriting the Constitution and all of that nonsense. But you do annoy all of the people who have pistol braces, and you do annoy people who make guns at home, and you do annoy people who are dispensing with their late father's gun collection, and you annoy people who had bump stocks. And yes, there aren't that many of those people relative to the population at large. But when you tell those people, as the Biden administration did, that not only is it inventing out of whole cloth a new definition of words that have been in the statute book for decades, but that those who are unaware of the change or weren't expecting the change are retroactively in violation of the law and are potentially guilty of a felony, you really annoy those people. And they go out and they vote against you. And, I think this has been, as you say, a net drag on Biden, and he's got nothing to show for it either way.
The other complicating factor here, too, is that obviously one of these rules that we're talking about, the one that kind of set up the other two, was put in place by former President Trump. Sure. And he has, in fact, gone out on the campaign trail and defended it as the right thing to do. Now, it seems, if you're looking at it from 10,000 feet, it's fairly obvious who I would imagine most gun owners are going to say is more on their side in this fight. But that is something that does color it a bit, right? I mean, he created the the first attempt to manipulate the law in this way to ban a firearm accessory, and Biden kind of just copied him in a number, for these preceding rules. So, I don't know. What do you make of all that?
Well, and look, as you know, I have no brief for Donald Trump whatsoever, and I profoundly hope that he's not the Republican nominee. So I say this not to defend Trump, but just to analyze the landscape honestly.
Sure.
I think the problem for Biden is that he is also in favor of the bump stock ban. So if the election comes down to Biden versus Trump, then the pro-gun voter who is considering which candidate to vote for is going to say, well, I'll vote for the guy who didn't do all the rest of the stuff, who isn't calling for an assault weapons ban, who isn't calling for universal background checks, who isn't vilifying gun owners, who isn't making weird comments about fighting American people with F-15s. If the question is who is better on the Second Amendment, say Donald Trump or Ron DeSantis, or Donald Trump or Tim Scott, I'm like, I think Donald Trump deserves to own the decision that he took, which wasn't just a decision that implicated the Second Amendment, but as we've been saying, that made many of the same executive overreach mistakes that we've been criticizing Biden for.
And was found unconstitutional for the same reason.
Right, exactly. So I say that in no way to defend Donald Trump or his decision, but I suspect that if and when they're obliged to choose between Trump and Biden, that Biden will have made it very clear which side he stands on in general, and therefore make that decision an easy one for most pro-gun voters.
Of course, it all seems to be overshadowed in the primary thus far, because there was sort of a clear strategy by Ron DeSantis to try and get to the right of Trump on gun policy, but and on lots of different kinds of policy, right? But it just hasn't really paid off to this point yet. The race has really been taken over by obviously the charges filed against the former president. In that's been the focal point, and policy hasn't really been a huge point yet. Who knows what could happen from here? Like I said, it's a pretty completely unprecedented situation that we're seeing. So it is difficult to analyze it in the sort of traditional way you would, right, for previous elections. But, may you live in interesting times, right?
Well, I never wanted to live in interesting times. I've written before. I quite like living in times of peace and prosperity. It's a curse, remember?
Yes, exactly. That's exactly my point. But you don't get to choose. We don't get to choose it.
No, that's very
either
true.
way, we really appreciate you coming on and taking the time to talk with us and walk us through both the legal side of this and the political side as best as possible. So we'll absolutely have to have you back on in the near future as well. Always love having you on the show. One of my favorite writers who I respect quite a lot. So where people, if they want to find out more about you, hear more of your musings, your analysis, where can they do that?
Well, I write at National Review. I have a Twitter account at Charles C.W. Cooke, and I also have a podcast called The Charles C.W. Cooke Podcast, very original title, which is on all major services and has a fairly eclectic collection of guests. So I'd say those are the three places.
All right, wonderful. Well, people should head over and check those out. I read all your stuff and listen to your podcast, so I recommend others do it as well. But that's all we've got for right now. We're going to head on over to the news update.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, it's time for the weekly news update. I'm contributing writer Jake Fogelman, joined, of course, by Reload founder Stephen Gutowski. How you doing this week, Steve?
I'm doing pretty good. How was your weekend? And did you do anything interesting lately? Go to the range or get a new gun or anything like that?
So haven't gone to the range. I did get a new sort of everyday carry accessory, I guess you could say. I've sort of been persuaded by the John Correas of the world that maybe having an OC spray or a pepper spray is not the worst idea in the world. So I finally, after hearing him and other folks like that, extol their virtues for a long time, I said, what the heck? I picked one up and I've actually started carrying it every day. So added that to my public self-defense repertoire.
Nice. Yeah, it's what John has a saying for that, right? It's something between a harsh word and a gun, basically.
And that's exactly my thought process, right? It's like, you're already not super likely to get into a deadly force encounter. You're much more likely to get into a physical altercation where something, obviously not a firearm, isn't required in those cases. So it just sort of made sense to me. Plus, they're not very expensive, so it's pretty
like $5 for a good pepper spray.
Right. Yeah. So it's just not that tough, and they don't take up much space in your pocket. So if you're already someone that's inclined to carry tools like that, it's just a really easy thing to add to your repertoire.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Plus, it's almost never, a big legal problem. You can usually carry pepper spray most places in most jurisdictions, unless they have, unless it's a secure facility or something where they have,
right.
Magnetometers and all that stuff. But which brand did you get? I use, I think Saber is what I get. I think John recommends that one often, and it's like $5 on Amazon.
I was going to say Saber and Palm are the two that I saw. I just chose Palm because I thought the canister looked smaller and it would be less, intrusive in my pocket. So I just went with that one. But yeah, Saber Red and Palm are the two that I see that get touted the most.
Yeah, Saber Red's what I carry myself. And it's what I have my girlfriend carry too.
Yeah, I got one for my girlfriend as well.
Yeah, I mean that's another thing too. Like, if you don't want to carry a firearm, or you live somewhere where it's very difficult to legally do that, which is an issue for my girlfriend. Works in DC. She takes Metro. It's difficult to get the DC permit, not impossible, but more difficult than Virginia. And it's they limit you pretty significantly on where you can carry. And then also you can't carry on the Metro in DC. In Virginia you can, because it's a DC specific law, which apparently no one has ever been prosecuted under, which is why you can't challenge it. You have no standing. There was a recent case litigating all this, which makes no sense to me, but I am not a federal judge, so not at this point at least. And so if you can't carry a gun, oftentimes you can carry permit. You can carry pepper spray, which is definitely better than nothing, I would say. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah,
and
like
and it's perfect for those situations where, like John says, between where verbal confrontation is the solution and deadly forces. There's a lot of stuff that can happen to you in between those two scenarios. And so, if you're carrying a gun and you don't carry some sort of less lethal or deterrent, an OC spray of some sort or whatever else, you might find yourself reaching for a gun when it's not the right thing to do.
Yeah. And that was one of the big things in my thought process too, is there's no sort of intermediate step to take there. If the only tool you have on you is a firearm, you could easily get yourself into some pretty hot legal trouble in those scenarios. So it just another thing to cover your bases.
Yeah. And like you were saying, you're much more likely to run into some scenario where it's not deadly force, but deadly force isn't justified, but some sort of force may be. It's just like carrying medical supplies or having medical training. It's sort of the same idea. Like you might need that if you get into a deadly force altercation, but also you're probably just likely to run into some situation in your life that requires some sort of medical knowledge. You're probably much more likely to run into that than you are a deadly force scenario.
Yeah.
And if you're going to carry a gun around on you because you are concerned you may run into a deadly force scenario, that it is something that's absolutely a real possibility. Why not also prepare for the things that are even more likely to happen to you?
Yeah, no, that's exactly my thought process. And I can confirm after a week of carrying every day, it's totally doable. It's not one of those things where it's a burden on your life to do. So I can officially recommend it to people out there.
Yeah, I just put it in my pocket. It's not a hard thing to do. As far as carrying some sort of, defense implement goes, it's pretty low effort, I would say.
Yeah.
But that's great.
I would say, what about you? Didn't you just do some fun stuff at the range this past weekend?
Yeah, actually during the week. It's one of the only perks of working for yourself is that you can make your own hours. And if you want to go to the range in the middle of the day, you can. It's usually to give up your 9 to 5 and work for yourself. You also often end up working 24/7, but this is one of the limited things that you get to do is make your own hours. And so I went to the range with a friend, and got to do some shooting. Shot the 365X macro and the 320X5, which, these gun companies and their naming schemes, it's always, I think Smith & Wesson's the only one who has it figured out, at least as far as semi-automatics go. Their M&P line is just like, it's full-size 9mm compact. They don't throw in random numbers for no reason.
Right.
But those two guns, regardless, are very, very fun to shoot and very accurate. And so I was very happy with the 365X macro, which is my carry gun. I haven't had any issues, by the way, for those following along with my carry saga with the red dot that comes with that gun from the factory, the Romeo Zero Elite, I believe is the one that I have. I also got a Romeo 1 for the 320X5. Both of those have held up really well ever since I replaced the battery on the one for the 365X macro, which that was pretty disappointing that it died that fast. I think it died within like a month of first buying it, but since then it hasn't given me any issues, and so I'm hoping that it was just a battery problem. Maybe that particular model sat around for a while. I don't know. That's the only real downside I've seen with the red dot so far. It does make it a little bit easier to shoot, especially once you get used to using the red dot and you can kind of ignore the iron sights, because that can be hard to do at first. Yep. But I think it's an advantage in the long run if you're going to be shooting under stress in a defensive situation. So been happy with that. I also, by the way, my friend brought an MP5 that he owns, and probably one of the most interesting configurations that I've seen, right? Because the MP5 is famous as a subgun, right, from the 80s, and they're probably one of the more popular and affordable Class 4 full autos out there, that people own as civilians. Probably one of the cheaper ways to get into that field. You don't have to pay the price of a McLaren to buy one of those. They're more like the price of a used Honda, maybe.
I was going to say cheap is relative here.
Yes. I mean, they used to be something like 10K to get into, but I think they're probably more now. I imagine that whole market is way up like everything else since inflation hit us. But interestingly, his was not a Class 4, but it also wasn't the more affordable, easier to buy 16-inch barrel version either, right? You see those around too. So you see a lot. Thompsons have that now. The semi-automatic 16-inch barrel Thompsons are relatively popular. And from Aero, I think Aero Precision makes them. And you have, is it Aero Precision? Whoever. He actually, the most fascinating thing about this was that I guess he bought a conversion. There's a dude who makes conversions of these guns where you can import the parts and then he can make you an SBR semi-auto. Like, it's not a Class 4. It's not full auto. It's semi-automatic, but it has the short barrel on it. And I have to say, after shooting that gun, I'm really only ever shot that in full auto, right? Because that's why people own them,
right?
Usually. And it's fun to shoot in full auto. There's a lot of blowback, a lot of gas gets in your face, but it's still a lot of fun. It's a 9mm, right? Subgun. Those are all pretty fun. But the semi-auto version that he's got, you got to get a tax stamp for it still, like a Class 4, but you don't have to pay whatever they're going for now, $15K, $20K. I don't know what they would be. You're maybe paying $2,000, $3,000 for one. And honestly, shooting it is super smooth and semi-auto, very accurate at, home defense distances. And it's light. So it kind of makes me feel like that's a really ideal home defense gun. That was the takeaway that I had from shooting it. It's like, this is a gun that I think is better than a 9mm pistol for home defense, right? Because, you know, it's bigger, obviously, but you can store it in your house. Not that hard. And it's more accurate. It's easier to control, easier to shoot than a 9mm handgun. And it's also easier. It's lighter than an AR or a pump action shotgun, or even some sort of pistol caliber carbine, right? Shorter barrel. It kind of checked all the boxes I could see for a home defense gun. I mean, it's great in corners, going around tight spaces because it's got the shorter barrel. That's the whole idea of this gun in the first place, right? These sub guns, but the semi-automatic, shooting in a semi-automatic is super accurate. So it's
got the most. You forgot the most important factor, the cool factor.
It is cool, yes.
You have a legit HK MP5 that's an SBR.
It is fun to smack the.
That's right.
The bolt. It is. It's fun to smack the charging handle on that thing. It just is. It's like smacking the bolt release on an AR or something.
Right.
There's a certain, or pumping a pump action shotgun. There are certain, or doing the lever action on a lever action. There are certain things in the firearm world, the mechanical side, that it's just fun. But yeah, it's interesting because I really legitimately thought that was a high quality home defense gun, especially for a smaller person or a woman. Like, it's because it's lighter, it's super controllable, it's easy to move around in tight spaces, and it shoots 9mm instead of like 5.56 or something like that. So it's a bit less concern there about over penetration. Although really all these rounds will still over penetrate your drywall. Like, that's not really doing much to stop any reasonable self-defense round anyway. But regardless, that's what it struck me. And it's just sort of unfortunate that because of the way our gun laws work, that sometimes aren't terribly logical. You really can't buy these as home defense guns, at least not in that configuration. And they get a lot more unwieldy if you're putting a 16-inch barrel on something that's supposed to have like I don't know what an MP5's normal barrel length is, but 8 inches maybe.
Right.
And so, like half of a 16-inch barrel. So it's just kind of unfortunate that you can't actually buy something like that for in a practice. I mean, you can, right? You can go out and do the process. You can form one and you can do all this stuff. It's just a huge cost add and time add. And there's a bunch of other things that come along with owning an NFA item, like telling the ATF when you're crossing state lines with it and stuff like that. It's not impossible. It's just adds an extremely, it adds another layer of annoyance to owning a firearm is what I'll say. And it's not a popular thing to do, obviously. And it's not something where your average person is going to walk into a gun store and be able to walk out with an MP5 that's semi-auto but short barrel. That's just not a common thing to be able to do. It's possible. It's just not common because of the way the laws work. Anyway, the experience was a lot of fun, and that was my main takeaway was this bit about our gun laws, because of course that's what I do for a living, right?
Right. Yeah.
But so what do we, all that aside, what do we got going on news-wise this week? We actually just, I guess we have some news. I mentioned this on the main interview, but the Supreme Court was supposed to hand down presumably was going to hand down its decision in the Biden ghost gun ban appeal. The rule, the ATF rule, is blocked, and DOJ wants the Supreme Court to issue a stay or take up the case directly. And they had until 5 p.m. on Friday. They'd issued a stay, an administrative stay. Justice Alito, and that is set to expire soon here as we're filming. Actually, I guess it already has, but they, instead of doing anything with it, Alito just issued another stay until next Tuesday. So I don't know. They didn't do their homework, I guess. The justices got tired and wanted to go home for the week. I don't know. and they waited until like 4:30 to.
I was going to say, sort of
sell it.
anticlimactic.
Yeah, so we waited to film this, and I don't know why the justices don't think of poor reporters like us who have to sit around and wait.
That's
for them
right.
To do these
Won't someone
things,
think of
but-
the journalists?
Yeah. But anyway, so obviously we don't have any real update on that. We will, of course, follow that when it comes through next Tuesday. But we do have some other news. Yes.
Yeah, that's right. So first, we'll start with some of the links in the newsletter that folks can check out by signing up for that newsletter. But we got some good reporting from Fox News, who've been following sort of the fallout from the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, which was the federal gun law that Joe Biden signed last summer. And the provision of that bill is being interpreted by his Department of Education to preclude funding for school hunting and archery programs. So there's been some political backlash over that.
Yeah, there's several Democrats who've come out and criticized the president for interpreting the law this way, right? You had Manchin, Sinema, and Tester all say that this is not what the provision was meant to do. There's a provision in the law that basically says you can't use funding to train people on how to use firearms, and it seems clearly to be targeted at not using it for training teachers to carry guns in schools.
Yeah.
It's like sort of a compromise aspect in there. They put in a bunch of funding for school safety upgrade programs, but they don't want it to go to training teachers to carry firearms in schools. So they included this provision, and now the Department of Education is taking that provision and interpreting it to mean that you can't use federal funds to do any sort of gun training for anyone, or dangerous weapon training, actually. So it extends beyond guns. That's where the archery thing comes in. And that has upset a number of Republican senators, but now also Democratic senators.
Yeah, it's interesting to see the political fallout, especially. I think it's worth noting we're heading into an election season with all three of these senators that are up for re-election. So worth noting. But we have another story out of Reason Magazine about gun owners in New Zealand being doxxed, and not for the first time, thanks to a leak of record keeping that the government keeps. Gun owners there are required to be registered with the government, of course. So this is not an uncommon occurrence in places that have such records of gun owners.
Yeah, this is New Zealand is kind of hitting all of the common pro-gun talking points about why people don't want a registry.
Right.
Because your information can get leaked, one, as this story indicates. And then obviously New Zealand also uses that registry to confiscate firearms from people in the wake of a mass shooting in that country. So, they're sort of hitting for the cycle on this point. And it does remind me, though, of a story that we broke last year, right, where California, which has similar registration requirements, also just leaked all of the information about who has a concealed carry permit in the state, their address and their names, their professions, oftentimes, including judges, law enforcement officials. So, it's something that happens fairly regularly.
Yeah, especially when you're talking about detailed record keeping. But speaking of California, this brings us to our last link in the newsletter. We have a final ruling from a federal judge. It's funny, it's been 3 years now, but litigating the COVID era restrictions on gun stores. So Ventura County, California specifically did not allow gun stores to be open as part of their emergency orders. And we have a federal judge now that says that that's okay under the Bruin test.
Yeah, and they used that same reasoning that we've seen time and again here to uphold, mostly to uphold hardware bans, assault weapons bans and magazine limits, things like that, where basically the argument goes that there's a modern problem that didn't exist at the founding. Usually it's mass shootings. In this case, the judge pointed to the COVID pandemic, although I would imagine that the founders dealt with plagues and pandemics as well. But regardless, she pointed to this modern issue, and therefore, that allowed her to analogize on a looser basis to the founding era's gun laws. And this was sort of a more half-hearted attempt at this particular reasoning, I think. You've seen this before. This happened in the Oregon case as well, where instead of really trying to find anything that was even a remotely similar gun law, she kind of just listed all the gun laws that existed, gunpowder regulations, different bans on surety laws, basically. There's kind of just throwing everything at the wall and saying gun laws existed, therefore they're all analogous to this total shutdown of all gun stores and ranges during the pandemic that California did. So it's interesting. It's an interesting case. And it really rolls into the next story we're going to talk about too, because there was also a federal judge in Connecticut that upheld the state's assault weapons ban and magazine limits under very similar reasoning, right?
Yeah, so we have a federal ruling denying a preliminary injunction. So the gun rights group in this case requested a preliminary injunction on both the assault weapon ban and their ban on magazines capable of holding more than 10 rounds. And like you said, it's sort of become the go-to blueprint for upholding hardware bans in this case. We've seen it happen at least 4 other times now by federal judges under similar circumstances where they say, well, the plain text of the Second Amendment says this, and, the Supreme Court previously said in Heller and Bruin that guns that are in common use are covered under that plain text. But if you look at the empirical evidence, magazines that hold more than 10 rounds and AR-15s are not actually used commonly for self-defense. And so therefore, the plain text doesn't cover them and they can be banned legally. And that's almost verbatim what this federal judge ruled in this case. And we've seen it, in a few cases in the past. So this has clearly become the go-to blueprint for regions, but more specifically judges looking for ways to uphold these hardware bans.
Yeah, you got those two arguments side by side oftentimes in these cases where either they argue the affected guns or accessories aren't covered by the plain text, or that there's some the development of new firearms technology has led to a modern problem that wasn't foreseen by the founders, and therefore you can use a broader analogy. Those are sort of the two main arguments that you see now.
I would say the judge in this case ruled that first part that, it's not covered by the plain text. But even if I did decide that it was covered by the plain text, this is how it would happen. Well, it's an unprecedented social concern. And so therefore I can loosely analogize to concealed carry bans on Bowie knives to cover flat out possession bans on AR-15s and magazines.
Yeah, that's what you'll usually see, right? In a lot of these cases where they'll just start with the idea that these aren't in common use for. Well, what you're seeing a lot of is not that they're not in common use, but specifically that they're not in common use for self-defense.
Right.
That is what they'll try to narrow the common use standard to that, even though that's not really what Heller said, or even Miller, which is where Heller got the common use standard from. But they try to make it a much more narrow decision about whether these are in common use for self-defense, and not even just that people believe they're buying these guns for self-defense, but that there actually is evidence that you fired more than 10 rounds commonly in self-defense shootings. That's what most of these judges have done with the magazine restrictions, for instance. You saw that in Oregon as well, where they argue based on very limited databases of public reports about self-defense shootings. If they don't mention that more than 10 rounds were fired by the defender, then the judge concludes that it's not common for magazines that hold more than 10 rounds to be used in self-defense, or at least be necessary for self-defense is sort of the idea they're getting at with this. So, and then they'll do what you mentioned, where it's like, okay, even if that doesn't hold up, I'm going to go to the Bruin test anyway, and I'm going to use this reasoning that has become very popular with how I get to a looser analogy.
Yeah, no, and it's a key distinction too, because it's not just in common use for self-defense, but under some sort of empirical use of self-defense. Like it's not
Right.
good enough that gun owners say, I bought this for self-defense. They have to, as you said, sort of pull from public research or some other source to show that they were actually used in self-defense.
Right, which is, again, also different from how Heller interpreted that whole concept because, they use the idea that people believe handguns are, that they're purchasing handguns out of the belief that they'll be used for self-defense. Heller didn't cite to like a statistical study of how often people use handguns in self-defense. It cited more like polling about why people say they buy guns or say they buy handguns. So, pretty different application and one that I would be very surprised to see stand up at the Supreme Court if it makes it there, though. Right? That's the tension in a lot of these things is. Will the Supreme Court take up a case like this? We have every indication that they should or would or are interested in doing that because they GVR'd several cases in this vein, right? There was the Maryland assault weapons ban case and the New Jersey magazine restriction case, both of which the law had been upheld by the lower courts. The court vacated the lower court ruling and then remanded those cases back down to the lower courts to rule in accordance to the new Bruin standard. But, it has only been about a year. So I know a lot of gun rights advocates want to see things move faster, but that's not really how the court operates. It's an open question of whether they're going to come back to this. It seems likely, but it hasn't happened yet.
Right. Yeah. We'll still take some more time for the cases to percolate. And then the last story that we're going to talk about this week is actually one you reported on. There's a averted tragedy in Memphis at a Jewish school where a hardened school security system combined with, quick acting police, by all measures, looks like saved what could have been another tragic incident at a school. If you want to tell us what happened.
Yeah, this one had a positive outcome, or at least as positive as you could hope for in this situation. A man, it turned out, it sounds as though he was perhaps a former student at this school. So the authorities there don't believe it was like a religiously motivated attack. It wasn't a hate crime necessarily. But regardless, this man showed up at this school in Memphis, Tennessee, Hebrew Academy, where carrying a gun, there's pictures of him from the school, from this incident where he's got through one door, but apparently was not able to get inside of the school where staff and children were. And then after being frustrated by that, he fired off shots outside the building and then fled, and was later confronted by local law enforcement where he got in a shootout with an officer and was wounded in that shootout and is now in the hospital. And he's been charged with 5 different crimes, including assaulting a first responder, attempted second-degree murder, carrying a weapon on school property, things of that nature. So it appears that the police chief in Memphis said that he believes that the work of the officers prevented a mass shooting in this situation. And then I would say also, of course, the school's preparation for potential violence is probably what really stopped this from being so bad, being a terrible incident, right? They obviously had lockdown procedures that they were able to put in place immediately. We don't know all of the details yet, but we do know that this school is part of a larger network of Jewish institutions that rely on there's a security network that they all rely on and share information and have a set of procedures that they all abide by. And includes things like video monitoring of access points and having close contact with local law enforcement in the case of potential threats. And it appears in this case that worked, that they were able to protect those kids by employing this, what seems to be a fairly unique and well-organized security structure that may well serve as a template for what other schools can do in these situations.
Yeah, certainly. It seems to vindicate, as you said, when done well, the whole school hardening approach to school security, which has become sort of a political battle in some regards in our current debate. But it does go to show it's a good case study that, when done properly, you can quite potentially save lives and prevent tragedies. So it's definitely a big story, and one I'm sure people will be watching from all across the country.
Absolutely. And it's definitely one that I think probably deserves more attention than it's gotten. Obviously, there's a lot going on in the news outside of this, but it's something that I think we'll continue to follow and hopefully try to get more details on exactly what the process was that worked in this case. As much as can be shared publicly, at least. I'm sure they don't want to give away every detail of how their security protocols work, but
Sure.
the broad view, hopefully we'll be able to get and see implemented elsewhere. But we will definitely be following up on that and doing our best to try and uncover exactly what makes this program different from others and how people can implement it elsewhere. Obviously the Jewish community faces a lot of heightened threats, disproportionate amount of threats and violence, based on their religion. And so they've clearly developed these security protocols in a way that perhaps other communities haven't. And so they probably have a lot of really good insight to share, I think, with the rest of us. And this is a perfect example that can be used for that. So, we will absolutely stay on top of that. But that is all we've got for this week. So if you want to read more about some of the things we talked about, you can head over to reload.com. You can buy a membership. That's what helps us stay afloat, helps us do this reporting. And of course, it will also get you exclusive access to all of our analysis pieces and hundreds of pieces that you will just simply can't get anywhere else. You also get access to this podcast a day early and the opportunity to appear on the show as in a member segment, which is one of my favorite segments. And, if you're not ready to make that jump and buy a membership today, you can, of course, help by sharing this episode or rating it on whatever app you're listening to it on. You can go ahead and give us a thumbs up on YouTube, anything of that nature. That stuff all helps immensely. The podcast has grown tremendously over the last 2 years, and we're hoping to keep that momentum up. And we need your help for that. So please do what you're able to. But we will be back again real soon. Thank you guys so much.